Hello, Spark fans, and welcome back to Advancing Spark, where I have, or maybe half an hour before I have to get to an airport, to go and train a load of people in Spark in Denmark. But I've just got enough time to talk to you guys about everything that is Databricks in May 2022. That's right, it is a newscast time. We are in June already, somehow. And so we're going to talk about everything that went out both on the Databricks platform and into a shiny new Databricks Runtime 11, which is fairly crazy. Got along very, very quickly. Before we get into that, other things to mention. One, don't forget, at the end of this month, at the end of June 2022, there is the Data AI Summit over in San Francisco. So Advancing Analytics are going to be there. I'll be doing a session with my good friend Danny Lee. We'll be talking about all sorts of crazy goodness. And yeah, if you're going to be there, come along, say hello. I will have giant piles of swag with me. So if you see me around, then just on the shoulder, and I'm sure I'll have some kind of goodies to share. But also just say hello, have a chat. Talk to me about what you are learning and what you like about Spark and Databricks and all that good stuff. And it'll be very exciting to see people there. If you're not going to be in San Fran in person, and you're not traveling around yet, which is absolutely understandable, then it is also a virtual conference. So just watch. The same as a lot of the virtual conferences that we've been doing over the past couple of years. Hop on, watch a load of content, load of tech stuff. I'll be doing a load of thoughts and things because there's going to be a load of keynotes, which nearly always have lots of releases. So there's going to be lots of news coming in 2 to 3 weeks' time about lots of Databricks goodness. Cool. Right. As always, if it is your first time, don't forget to like and subscribe. Say hello down in the comments. Tell us about these new features and what you think of them and if they're good and if you're using them and all that kind of good stuff. But until then, let's have a look at what they are. Okay, so as usual, I'm on the platform release notes. I've picked out March 2022. I'm on the Azure flavor of the release notes, which has 1 or 2 slight changes this time from the core Databricks notes, which are always based on AWS. So as always, going to whip down to the bottom and we'll work on the chronological order. And we'll just talk through what these really mean. So number 1. So Delta Live tables, you can now see the pipeline a user is going to run as. They've improved the UI slightly. Go and see who it's running. Fine, easy, nice, makes sense. If you've not seen anything of Delta Live tables, we've done a load of videos all about them in the past. Go and have a look at that. But now it's just nice to see which user context the pipeline's going to execute at. Okay, next one. So there's an updated Jdbc driver. So if you're connecting to the SQL endpoint, either via Databricks SQL or directly onto a high concurrency cluster, for example, you need to have a driver to connect to it. It needs to know how to talk to that particular SQL instance that's exposed via the endpoint, and that's done via the Databricks Jdbc driver. There's also an ODBC flavor of that driver known as Simba that we'll see quite a lot. Again, so that is now something you can just go and hop on. So there's an updated version, so you can go and grab that driver. If you're trying to connect to Databricks via Excel, for example, you need an ODBC driver. Things that don't natively have a Databricks connector, you'll probably need to have the Jdbc or ODBC. Use that. Jdbc or ODBC, depending on whether you're in a Java environment, Windows environment. Okay, we saw last video 10.5 going GA. So we saw kind of in preview, we talked through what that is, but we can go and have things. Interesting one, or interesting if you're a massive nerd like me. We now have the option to configure verbose logging. Now, what that means is that the logging that we can attach into an Azure Databricks workspace, and this is one of the Azure flavors that's slightly different. We can take our Databricks workspace, we can hook it up, so it'll pump out diagnostic logs, and they can go to an event hub. I can write it down to blob storage, or I can send it through to log analytics. Now, log analytics is what we tend to do, because we'd have like Data Factory sending it to log analytics and the data lake and the database. And essentially it's a central point for all of your different Azure resources. They all send logs to the same place, which just makes it so much more usable. So now in Databricks, we've got the ability to configure verbose logs. So every single cell execution that you do will pump out a log message saying, well, this is the notebook I'm running on. This is how long it took. This is what happened to me. This is the text in the command. So if you want just this is anything anyone has executed on any of my Databricks clusters, anywhere in my workspace, that can actually now be turned on. That is incredibly powerful logging. Now, it's going to generate a huge number of events. So be a bit careful. It's going to have a cost implication. You're going to span hundreds of thousands of events if you're doing lots and lots of notebooks all running in parallel. But the ability to do that is fairly huge. Definitely a big call out for Verbose audit logging. Incredibly powerful if you're working in a secure, regulated environment. So lots of insurance companies, lots of banks we've been working with recently will be very happy to see that button that we can now turn on. You do need to do that via the admin console. It's a thing you turn on at the workspace level. Okay, other bits and pieces. The Power BI connector. So Power BI connector is one of those things that already has its Databricks driver built into it. And now it'll actually understand better that you've got proxy config. So if you're trying to talk to Databricks via a proxy, they've improved that connector, which is always nice. Another one. Now this is kind of a hard one to talk around because you need to know what Unity Catalog's doing under the hood. So we currently have two-part naming when we're dealing with Hive. When we're dealing with our data tab and we've saved tables to Databricks. So I'm going to do with my AdventureWorks.company, AdventureWorks.product, whatever it happens to be. I've got the database name and the table name. As soon as we introduce Unity Catalog, we get three-part naming because we now have the catalog. I mean, my primary catalog dot AdventureWorks dot product. I've got three-part naming introduced. Now, any tables you've already got, any things that you've registered with Hive previously, will be registered under just a default Hive catalog, not the Unity catalog. So you need to shift them over. You need to grab those existing ones and go, right, you're now part of the catalog. Take this database, register all those tables in the catalog. That's kind of fairly annoying. You'd have to drop and recreate all those tables. This wizard essentially just says, take all those databases, all those tables, recreate them in this particular Unity catalog. Super useful. Shift things over, assign permissions, all that kind of stuff. Really good. It's going to help people adopt it when it's a bit more available. It's a new Azure region. Always good as we see more Azure regions crop up. Getting our Databricks to make it available in those regions is always flexibility. There's an issue with Databricks repos. That's more of a bug issue. So if you had an MLflow experiment that was pointing at something in a repo and then you've moved it over, that's going to cause various issues. So they've actually sort of looked at that and resolved that issue. I've not dug into that scenario when it comes up, but if that is an area that you'll come across, obviously that's for you. Super useful. Another one to do with Databricks repos. So when Databricks repos first came out, there's a quite small limit on the number of files that could be held in our repo. There's something along the lines of 500 files, which isn't that many. So if you had inside your Git repo, if you had not just Databricks notebooks, but maybe like a little web app and maybe a database project and a few other things that are part of your solution, and they can generate hundreds and hundreds of tiny little incremental files, then you could hit that limit of 500 fairly easily if you're dealing with a fairly chunky system. And they upped that number. And it sounds like people hit that number, and so they've upped it again. So you've now got 5,000 artifacts you can have inside a Git repo that is hooked into Databricks repos, which is just, yeah, super useful. So 5,000 notebooks, 10,000 overall files, which is a lot. That's a lot of things. You can have a lot of things in your Git repo now. Right, another one, which is crazy. Super excited. Python notebooks. I can be writing a bit of Python. I can be doing my data frame manipulation, and then I want to check what that looks like. And so I'll add a cell into my notebook and do %SQL, the magic command. I'll then do a select star. I'll do my command. I'll basically query the data and go, right, cool, that's the data how I want it. And then I can't get at the results of that select statement. So I have to take the SQL I've written and then jam that into a bit of Python saying my data frame equals spark.sql and then have that same SQL. So in lots of kind of analytical notebooks or notebooks written by business people, you know, they'll have their SQL query in a %SQL and then they'll have it replicated again in an actual data frame just because they can't talk to each other. Or they couldn't talk to each other until now. Now this thing, really cool. If I just grab that, open it up, what we're now going to see, if we've got a little bit of Python going on, and then we do %SQL and we do a SQL select statement, get a SQL cell result stored as a PySpark data frame underscore SQL df. So you can now actually then just go, well, I'll just use that, you know, my new df equals underscore SQL df, and then just go and keep using that data frame. That's really cool. So actually now you can just use %SQL. You can use the SQL magic command to build out the results set and then just pull that back in. Be aware, because that automatically displays the results of our data, that's still going to be an extra Spark action. Not going to be that efficient to do it that way. But if you wanted to show the results of that partway through your notebook execution anyway, it's a great way to do it. I mean, you can just use the little SQL editor and just use it as a straight SQL cell, but still get access to that underscore SQL data frame, apply that into a new data frame, and then keep on going using that. Really nice, just little shortcut just to help people. It's nice. Makes people happy. All right, we've got a new improved workspace search. So if you're digging around, you're trying to find things. It was also not great in terms of trying to find notebooks, to the point when I never ever use it. So obviously it's gotten better. So if you're looking for notebooks that contain a certain keyword, notebooks that contain a search term, you can get preview of your matching content. So you can now just work a little bit better if you're digging around a workspace to actually sort of see what's inside there, which is useful. Okay, we have Databricks Runtime 11 is now out in beta, so I will take a look at that after we've done these ones. There's a few interesting things inside there as well. New data types inside automatic feature lookup. So automatic feature lookup is when we're dealing with online models. We're dealing with real-time scoring. And real-time scoring had an issue with the great feature tables inside the normal batch scoring mode because they're stored as big delta tables, and doing that real-time lookup is just a little bit too slow for trying to do absolutely super fast real-time scoring. So they made it available to say, actually, you can now look up on something like a MySQL database. And it didn't support all the potential data types. So now this is an update to say, if you're going to an Azure database for MySQL, so at the moment a request to score comes in, hits that web service, that tries to score it, and it's doing a feature store lookup, and it tries to go to the Azure database for MySQL to retrieve those values. It didn't used to be able to do decimal types, array types, and map types. It now can. So it's improved that functionality, it's improved the flexibility. You can use that in some more times. If you're trying to do real-time model serving and you're trying to use a feature store lookup table from a MySQL database, then that's gotten better. Final little bit of craziness, similar to the SQL one, is just a thing that's like, oh yeah, that should have been there ages ago. We can now just jump in and go, I don't know, I want to take this particular cell. Got a little function defined. I want to copy that. I'm just going to copy that cell, and I'm just going to paste that cell above. Oh god, just so useful. Just crazy useful. Yeah, you can now do that. Gonna paste, but between browser tabs and windows, it'll actually allow you to open that up, open a new tab, paste it across, and that's super useful. So kind of, you know, if you've got a reference notebook and then you're writing a new notebook and you're like, oh, I'll just copy that cell in, that cell in, that cell in, rather than highlighting the code and copying and pasting manually, you can just copy and paste the whole cells. It's really cool. Really nice. I like it. Okay, cool. So that is all of the platform releases that we've had throughout May 2022. Let's go and have a look at the new runtime. So Databricks Runtime 11 is out in beta, so don't use it in production workflows yet. Don't know how long it's going to be in beta. We might see a few changes go in there because it is a major version release. It's not going 10.5, 10.7, 10.8. It's going 11. That means there can be some breaking changes, and it means that, you know, there might be some more things coming in here because it's still in beta. So have a look at what we've got. So there's a big change if you are a more open sourcey fan than what you get inside of Databricks natively. So Databricks notebooks are not Jupyter notebooks. And it's really confusing because, you know, you come from the world of Jupyter and then you open up Databricks and it's like, oh, well, they're mostly Jupyter notebooks. It feels like a Jupyter notebook. It's made to be almost exactly the same as a Jupyter notebook. But importantly, they're not. And actually, up until now, they use a different kernel to process Python to actually sort of put out the outputs. And that meant you couldn't take just any old plain Jupyter notebook and run it inside Databricks and get the same results. Certain things wouldn't work. This first one right out the gate of saying Python notebook now use the IPython kernel means it supports a load of IPython commands, meaning it can do things you couldn't do previously. So one of the things you used to have this, so that IPython core display, the actual output of a cell being rendered, you basically use a different kernel to render it. Meaning if you had a Python library that you'd pulled in that was trying to use that ipython.core.display, it wouldn't work inside Databricks. Now that from 11 onwards, they've switched that kernel, it's going to use that. It means it's a load of open source libraries you can now use that previously didn't work that will now work, whereas they just only had to work on Jupyter Notebook previously. So big change over that. Changes how what we actually get into entitled logging. And we can now actually query some of these standard down. Lots of things that we can do. So that's a big one for open source compatibility. I'm assuming one of the things that means is you can do this. So IPy widgets is essentially, rather than having, it's very different to widgets that we have in a Databricks notebook where they go right to the top and they control the whole notebook. But they're actually things that you can place on a particular visual. So you can make visuals that are in a notebook cell's output. You can make those interactive. You can make it so you can dig in and play with them. So I grabbed, there was an example in the documents that's kind of hard to see. Let me grab that. If I grab this thing, there's lots of information, tells us all about it. We can go and see. And then in that notebook, I had to play, and that didn't work when I was playing it yesterday. Maybe they fixed it. Maybe it works now. Oh, let's see. Okay, no, it doesn't work. So this new interact code is essentially allowing us to specify widgets that are linked into that particular kind of bit of Python output. So I grabbed that notebook, I pulled it into an environment, I ran it through with that 11 runtime. What we see in that last piece after that interact, there we go. So we've now got this little slicer, we've got like a choice. We can go and have a play with the variables and essentially allow people to interact directly with notebook, directly with the output of the notebook, hide inside our particular environment, which is great. That's the thing that we can now do. As of Databricks Runtime 11, you can use IPy widgets if you're actually putting out things that support them, if you're using Python visualization libraries that will actually allow you to. But yeah, we can have a play with that. Other things in Databricks Runtime 11. So we can now write Parquet data in legacy mode. If we're going to Synapse Connector, essentially there's some issues with the Synapse Connector if we're trying to write directly into dedicated SQL pools. That's if you're trying to go directly into the Synapse database, which is now really confusing. It's just called the Synapse Connector. Well, where does that go? This is for if we're trying to get into dedicated SQL pools directly, the MPP database, and it uses a staging area in the middle where it dumps all the data out to into Parquet, and then Polybases, or copy, it does a copy into these days, into the dedicated SQL pool. It was using an old format of Parquet because that's what dedicated SQL pool liked originally, and they've updated it in line with dedicated SQL pools. It's now a bit better. It has now gotten better at transferring data to Synapse, which is nice. Another new little SQL thing. We can now query what Databricks Runtime Databricks is on through SQL. They've got that current version function where you can just say, well, what are you? Are you running 11? Are you running something else? Right. Is my cluster still turned on? We can go and see what that does. If I can write a little bit of SQL. That's not how you write SQL. There we go. So we get the full build version of everything that we're doing. We can see that it is currently 10x. The 10.0.x is our Databricks version. We're on Databricks version 11. 11.0, I can read. So if you're trying to actually include in your audit notes, you want to tag something with the version of Databricks that loaded at any one time and just have that in your audit logs and do some deep and dirty querying or something. If someone gives you a SQL endpoint and says, just use that, and you're like, what version is it? You can now just say select current version, and that'll just tell you the current version of Databricks that you're currently using. Nice. A little bit of alignment of some behavior. So with Delta tables, if you dropped a constraint previously, you could drop and then give it a name of a constraint that didn't exist. And it would go, all right, and not tell you whether or not that was a real constraint or not, which is fine. That's very Sparky. Spark just goes, if you tell it to do something, it doesn't do anything. It just goes, all right, and does nothing. Now, to give it consistent behavior with other SQL objects and other commands, that'll now throw an error. So you need to do drop if exists, and then now it'll drop it if it's there. It won't tell you if it's not there. And that just brings it in line with the same as, create table and drop database and all that kind of thing. It just means it's a lot more standard. That's been standardized just for dropping constraints. Change. There's a new a new select star command, which is really funky. So if you are a terrible human being and use select star a lot, which honestly I do, and anyone coming from the DBA SQL side of things, we're just looking aghast in horror going, you use select star, you wrongin'. Because it's very much known, you want to have good performant selections. You don't want to have just get all columns. Like, well, what if I do? In lots of my generic loading processes, I'm saying, well, just pick everything that you've received, even if it's evolved, even if it's got new attributes that it didn't previously have. I want that to be included so I can then pass it on and cleanse everything or put it through a generic routine. So saying bring the whole table back is something I do quite a lot. What we can do now is saying bring back the whole table except this list of columns. So if I had lineage, if I had auditing, if I decorated every single row with a load of system columns, and that was consistent on all of my different tables, I could say, well, select all of my columns except for these columns, except for my audit stamp, except for my load date, and then I can bring all that back. And that's now really, really nice and consistent. If I wanted to do that previously, I'd have to write a little bit of Python to read out the schema, strip out the things I want, turn that back into a select statement. That's just really annoying. So being able to say select star except a list of columns is actually super useful for doing really generic, really kind of dynamic querying. Yeah, I like it. Makes me happy. And then finally, we now got support for dropping tables from Delta. Dropping columns from Delta. So if you wanted to say, well, actually update Delta table, alter the table, this Delta table, remove this specific column. And then it will just drop it from the schema metadata. The same way that we see when schema evolves, and it just changes this current schema in the transaction log. And therefore, when we query it, it looks like all previous files that have been loaded add that column, and they just have nulls for it. It does the same kind of thing. So we say alter table, drop this column, and then we query that table again. It will look like that column never existed. Now, in the underlying files, in the Parquet files, that column's still there. The data's still there. And if we want it to rewrite all of those files to actually physically drop that data, got this command called reorg table, apply purge. Sounds very, very strong-handed. So we can now say, well, actually, I've removed the column in terms of metadata. So it no longer looks like I have that column, and any future data going in is not expecting that column. But if I physically wanted to get rid of that data from previous existing Parquet files, I can reorganize that table, purge data that is no longer part of that schema, and that's going to create new versions of those Parquet files that no longer have the data. Now, like with everything Delta, it's not going to delete the originals until we do a vacuum. That's just a transactional change. I can time travel back to before I did that. That stuff all still hangs together. But just be aware, if you do drop columns and you wanted to eventually update those files and actually get rid of them, you need to run that reorg table command to actually go and apply those changes to data. Cool, and that's all our functionality changes. That is Databricks Runtime 11. Lots of interesting new stuff dotted around. A few things in there because this is a major change, because we're going from 10 to 11. There are some behavioral changes you need to be aware of. Add functions now support byte sequences. That's just useful if you're doing that kind of thing. It's not a string you need to apply, but it's a byte sequence. Fine. One that might break some things is string formatting and print if. So if you're doing those things and you're using it mainly in SQL, so you're doing format string as a SQL thing, and you used to put $0 dollar in. So that's saying I want to take the first argument. So if we're doing a string formatter, and I'd have hello, my name is blah, and I'd have like some curly braces to be my input when trying to inject values to build out that string. With all the Python-esque version of things, that's all base 0. So you'd say, well, the first argument is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And that same way was applied in the SQL side of things. And then that's not actually how lots of databases do it. They tend to start off at 1. So from this version onwards, you can no longer use %0. That's going to throw an error, that's going to break. And the first argument is %1. So if you've done a load of stuff in SQL using string builders, you need to be aware that's going to change. Okay, writing out CSV values. If you had a quote in there and you're pushing it out, a null value would just be an empty string with quotes. That's no longer going to be the case. So if you're writing out and it's null, it will no longer have quotes around it. It will just be an empty comma, nothing in the middle. That's just an empty string inside a CSV. And you can change, you can set that null value to be the quoted string. So even if you've got quoted, your quote parameter set on that CSV write output, that's going to change how CSVs are written. So if you're currently doing lots of integration work, if you make a load of CSVs for other things to be picked up and move on with and then ingest into their systems, it's going to be different unless you set those changes. Again, it's a major version change. Behavior is changing. You might need to make sure you're looking at this for backwards compatibility. You can only use the word external. If you're talking about you're writing for SQL to create tables, external is a property, so you can't externally, you can't use that in other strings. That's now a reserved keyword. And there's a log4j update. So if you're currently using any libraries that rely on log4j, using log4j itself, then that is a library change, and you need to go and have a look at that because that's going to break if you're expecting certain library versions, because that's going to come across. Oh, okay. Now that is my list of stuff. So lots of things in there. Loads of really nice little things in there. Copying cells between notebook windows, querying the output of a percentage SQL window and using that as a data frame. Just really, really useful. Being able to use lots more Jupyter-friendly bits of code actually just within our Databricks notebooks. Loads of nice little bits and features spread across. Again, the release notes we'll be seeing kind of just the ones on the platform you might not see in there just yet. They are being drip fed. We're on the 6th of June, 7th of June. Maybe they should all be in there by now. But certainly it may take another week or so if you're looking at things you're not seeing it in there. And yeah, as I said, Runtime 11 is still in preview. It is in beta. So you might find there's some new features added. You might find some things changed slightly. That's the current beta version as it currently stands today. And yeah, loads of interesting stuff. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know down in the comments which of those are actually going to change how you work. And no, I always say that, and then no one ever says anything because it's like, oh, I don't really care that, this background settings changed. But there's lots of little nice SQL quality of life improvements in there. Not little things you'd expect to be going, but certainly lots of things I watched and went, oh, yeah, no, that is super useful. So really interested to see if that's going to actually change people's opinions on what's coming out in this runtime. And yeah, as always, I'll catch you next time with more news. And yeah, enjoy.